the corporate sector in Japan, they had very, very high debt to GDP after the 80s bubble. So all through the
Hmm.
90s, the early 2000s, they had massive amounts of debt. And so part of this whole shift was they basically took the debt from the corporate balance sheet and put it onto the public balance sheet. And it
Hmm.
was like it was like a 2-decade process. And so when corporations reduce their own debt, that actually destroys money. That actually
Hmm.
reduces them too. And so you kind of had this period where like, you know, the Bank of Japan was doing this broad deficit monetization, but it was averaging something like 5% fiscal deficits a year. So they went as bad as like 8%, which is funny
Wow.
because we're talking 15% in the U.S. over the past 2 years in a row, whereas their worst was 8%, at least until this year. I think they hit like another 8. I got to see what they did for 2020. It wasn't as big as the U.S., but it was pretty big. But basically, pre-COVID, their worst one was 8% of
Mm.
GDP, but they averaged about 5% a year, which is rather high. And so basically, what you had was corporations deleveraging by about 2% of GDP a year, while the fiscal deficit was 5% of GDP a year, mostly monetized. And so what you end up getting was about 3% M2 growth, which is actually pretty low by most other country standards. And so it's not surprising you didn't see inflation, but you did
Hmm.
see a big increase in the Bank of Japan's balance sheet, and you saw
Mm.
that shift of debt from the corporate sector to the public sector.